Stash on my lip, but here's a good tip. At esports pools, gulp, don't sip. Pick big hitters who won't slip. If you like Skrill, don't ever bet on Nip, else you might end up rip. Now, the implications of Astralis' success using a stand-in are quite interesting for all parties concerned, including other teams using a stand-in, I think, because Astralis are a team that have been having issues recently fielding a full lineup. And in fact, after this tournament, it was announced that Device has been shut down for the rest of the year due to health issues, and so they won't have a full lineup for the rest of the year. So he was missing from the first game at IEM Oakland, which actually ended up being against NIP, and winning that game, in fact, put NIP directly through the semi-finals, and was the key reason why Astralis didn't get into the playoffs. Then Device was hospitalized. He came home. He had to skip the Blast Pro Series entirely. So Astralis last minute took in Dennis, the Swedish former Fnatic and more recently Godsent player, as a stand-in. They had an amazing performance in the group stage of Blast Pro Series. They actually managed to come first place in the group. They went undefeated. They won 4 games and drew 1. And in the final, which was just the top 2 teams playing each other, playing against SK Gaming, they won a map, the first map. They got to the third map. On the decider, they were at championship point on the 30th round of the last map. 1 round away from winning the tournament. They didn't manage to win. It went to overtime and SK Gaming won. But even so, being 1 round from winning under those circumstances is amazing. So there are a couple of ways we have to think about this. Like, what does this mean for Astralis specifically, that performed so well without their best player and with a stand-in? And what does it mean that a stand-in can arguably make you perform better at times? And what is the implication from this? So in terms of Astralis specifically, Astralis is a team on a downturn. You look at the last 3 months, so basically since the player break and since the major, they were top 8 at DreamHack Malmo, but they lost, especially on that second map, Mirage, in unconvincing fashion against the new Gambit squad that had Adren as the in-game leader. Then they went to ESL1 New York, which, by the way, so the Malmo tournament snapped that streak of top 4 finishes they had. They went to New York. Again, they didn't manage to place top 4. In fact, this time, because the format of the tournament was 8 teams, they didn't even manage to make it out of their group. They lost to Team Liquid. They went to the E-League Premier, where they did well, but they were on a bracket that meant they had to play Fnatic, the one that actually still had... Oh, no, actually, it was the brand new Fnatic with Golden, etc. So an experienced team. And then the semi-finals, they amazingly ended up playing C9 instead of G2, because G2 had managed to lose to C9, beat them, and then lost to FaZe in the finals. Okay, there's one good result, one that's more in line with the Astralis team of the past. They seemed to follow it up at Epicenter by getting a top 4 there. They finished 4th. They obviously did pretty well overall, got out of Group B, but then they end up losing to SK Gaming. And then you come to IEM Oakland, where, thanks to the Device situation, didn't get into the playoffs, finished 7th to 8th. So overall, they've been to, 5 tournaments in that span of time, and they didn't place top 4 in 3 of the 5. Now, admittedly, extenuating circumstances for the Oakland tournament, but all in all, these are worse results for Astralis. They're obviously a team at the moment that's having difficulty winning tournaments. They've only been in position, really, to win 1 tournament, and they didn't manage to do that. So it's not just that they had a better result here. It's that they had a better result, actually, in terms of how the entire result looked than basically the last 3 months. And you also have to consider, though, that the results changing at this tournament for Astralis aren't just down to Dennis joining the team and his play, which was very good. It's also because they swapped roles due to Device's disappearance from the lineup. Because Device was obviously the primary AWP of the team and had a lot of autonomy and freedom and used to play a lot of spots where he could be very mobile and switch up his position. So they didn't just take Dennis and shove him into the spots that Device played. They took Dupree and put him in Device's spots, and in fact gave Dupree the primary AWP. Now, Dennis then swapped into Dupree's spots, and Dupree has been less of a star player, had less resources in Astralis, although his actual performance had been pretty good over the span of time I'm describing here. So I actually think it's also worth pointing out that I think if they had have won that last round on cash and won the tournament, I'm pretty sure Dupree would actually have been the MVP of the tournament because he had not only good numbers, not as quite as good as Dennis, admittedly, but he had very good numbers in the final. He was the main reason in the final they were close to winning. And the fact, just the sheer amazing fact that a guy who wasn't being a primary AWP who could take over the primary AWP, play someone else's spots of the star player, and be so good, and especially in the final, I think would have meant he would have won the final, would have won the MVP for the whole tournament, rather. So with that said, Dennis was clearly pretty sick in terms of fragging. His numbers were very good for this tournament. It's just in the final he dropped off a bit. So to me, this is actually, the implication here is actually more on the Dupree end of things. It's more about making a case for how do you use Dupree, because we already knew he had a lot of versatility, but he showed even more versatility here. He showed that he can almost do seemingly anything. Like, we knew he was an amazing player and a star player because he's been a star player in the past in the old Dignitas, TSM, Astralis lineups before they moved Kirby into this entry fragging role when he was the primary entry. So we knew he could entry as one of the best players in the world. We knew he's a very good pistol player, especially with the Deagle. We knew that he's a pretty good second AWP, actually. He's been doing that the last few months, has been pulling it off. We knew he could lurk and play more of a defensive style as he's been doing for the last, well, almost a year. Well, it would be about a year at this point in time. Now we see, at least for one tournament, before people picked up on what he does and really pressured him as much, he can primary AWP as well and did a really good job doing that. Now, admittedly, he wasn't doing it in the same fashion that Device would primary AWP. And as such, I don't know that this would necessarily work more in the long run. I feel as though Device's style of AWPing is a better fit for them as a team, and Dupree just did a fantastic job of making do, and his style was a lot more in line with the Cajun B style, very safe style where you just try and be consistent, set your teammates up to know what shots you're going to hit, what you aren't going to hit, so you don't go for the ridiculous ones. And aside from those few crazy rounds in the final, I felt in general he just did a good job of that. And it wasn't the same as the Device style of AWPing and the whole game revolving around him. And that's another thing. There was elements of freedom in the rest of the team where people like Dennis overplayed or overperformed, where arguably that wouldn't be taking place within the usual Astralis preparation and scouting system that they apply. I also think if you make Dupree play as the primary AWP for many more tournaments, teams are going to scout it and they're going to make it harder for him, not least, by the way, because that happens to Device. One of the main reasons Astralis pivoted away from Train is because teams like SK and FaZe, and others, by the way, actually had started to figure out how to pressure Device, not so that you shut him down entirely, but you make him a little bit less impactful, and therefore you shut down the team, because on both sides of that map, he was very, very key. Now, I think you could certainly make a case that we've seen enough from Dupree in this tournament and his performance that maybe you should work some of this into it. Like maybe you should swap Device and Dupree if they're double AWPing on a map. Maybe you should sometimes mix up a little bit more freedom into the team, which is obviously an interesting part. Now, it's worth pointing out that a reason why you wouldn't add Dennis directly, despite his good performance here, is that they had to speak English to play with Dennis because he doesn't understand Danish. Now, first of all, adding anyone and having to speak in English, I think would be a big deal, not least culturally, because a lot of these players have come up within this special culture within Counter-Strike, how you play and the structure of how a team works and how you comm. But I also think because of the fact that you've got to consider Astralis is a team that wants to get a lot of info out there, comm very well, and use preparation, etc. I think that would be more limited if you had to speak only in English. So getting anyone who isn't Danish doesn't really seem like it's a reasonable expectation, bearing in mind there's so many talented Danish players, and they can go back to their old system and have a lot of success from it. Then you've got to add in, except for the final, except for about 2 maps really, they largely won from the CT side and having massive CT sides. So that's mainly just fragging. So it's mainly just people like Dupree, like Dennis, just having mad fragging CT halves where you just play your spot. There's less tactics and less preparation and scouting involved in making that work. So I think that is probably a small sample size scenario. And again, once people adapted, it would be a lot harder to make that work, as by the way FaZe is showing us at the moment. Also, you've got to throw in, finally, Xyp9x had a little bit of a return of form with some amazing clutches. And so you have to figure that saves you a round, gets you rounds, get you ahead in games when otherwise teams are coming back into it. And so you can't just, again, consider like Dennis's addition as being what makes Xyp9x have good clutches. Now, we know in general, Astralis' style is based around preparation, which includes scouting the opponent. Then it's based around execution, having your own tactics, you're picking the right one for your playbook, and then executing it as flawlessly as possible. Now, in this tournament, Astralis gained from being able to scout the opposing teams, especially because they knew the maps weeks in advance, but not be scouted themselves because nobody knew how they would play, and even more so with a new player and 2 role swaps, because Dennis is playing Dupree's spots and now Device's spots are being played by Dupree, who hasn't played those spots before. So that makes it near impossible to scout Astralis. So Astralis gained the edge in that particular sense. Then you've got to add in that the format of predetermined vetoes also helped here, because in a scenario where they didn't determine the vetoes before the tournament, because everyone agreed to the vetoes before they knew that Device was out, teams, if this had been a normal pick ban, could have used their 3 bans to actually force Astralis off their comfort maps. Astralis in the group stage only played Overpass and Inferno, the main maps they'd practiced. But if you saw how they were doing on Overpass and Inferno, you say, fuck it, let's waste some of our bans, take those maps away, let's make them play Cache, let's make them play Train, let's make them play these other maps, see how they play on the maps they probably haven't practiced as much. Teams couldn't do that. They were hindered by the format, actually. Then you've got to add in, Dennis probably wouldn't be that good a fit for their style anyway. Like, he's more of a free style of player. Add in the fact that he's Swedish, he's not going to be speaking Danish, and the fact that you, in the current setup, have to kick someone like a Device or Dupree, that's not very good. Now, I do think if you're in a world where somehow you can make it work without Kirby, you can make a case for it, but I'd still probably say it's better to get a Danish player if possible, because there's too many downsides, and I think there's a lot of short-term thinking here of what happened in one tournament that wouldn't play out later, as I'll get to when I talk about the implications of succeeding with stand-in. So I do think possibly this might have also showed Astralis that sometimes they need to have a bit more free-form play, that they can I'd say map dependent, open it up a little bit more and not have to be as structured. I think the structure, quite frankly, people overblow how predictable it is. I think it's just very effective, which is why they run it a lot. But I do think that for certain maps, like the fact that on Mirage they were so good and that on Inferno they completely turned it around, these were more troubling maps during their downturn of the summer onwards, because these were the maps that teams like FaZe, SK, obviously to a lesser degree Gambit playing Inferno, would all play and were all very good on. And this is where, especially on the CT side, you saw problems from Astralis. So I will say, this more freeform style, maybe they should give that a go when Dupree and Device are both back in the lineup in normal roles. A little bit more on the CT side of these maps, free it up a little bit more, and don't have to rely on that heavy utility style, which seemed to be their only real way to win before. With that said, I think this is also just a factor of Astralis as a team. One of the reasons I think for their downturn, as well as individual performances dropping off and other teams rising up, is actually that their original style, which they made famous, this very structured style, I think works a lot better on Overpass and on Train than it does when they switched to having to play loads of Mirage and Inferno, which are the most played maps at the moment, and which they always end up having picked into them or having to play against other teams. So I think that was a factor in taking them out a little bit, because those maps in Mirage and Inferno, especially on the T side, run a lot more off in-game leader reads and then individual plays. So I don't feel as though the structures helped them as much on those maps as it did on Train and on Overpass. Now, ignoring the Astralis side of the equation, which we've discussed, what are the implications? Like, what does it mean that you could potentially perform better as a team with a stand-in? Well, first of all, the expectations and pressure upon a team, so in this case Astralis, are way less, because you already know with a new guy, the margin for error is massive. Like, he's not going to know all the things you're going to do. He's not going to know the little nuances. So as a result, as counterintuitive as this might sound, that actually makes people less likely to tilt and be frustrated when they lose key rounds, because they're going to think, well, it's not his fault. I mean, he hasn't played in the team before. He doesn't know what we're supposed to do there. Or you'll lose a round and you'll go, oh, well, we haven't got our proper lineup anyway. This isn't what we prepared for. We're just playing, seat of our pants. So you're going to be a bit more loose as it is. You haven't had the time to prepare. You've got a little bit of a mental buffer in that sense against lost rounds. You don't even also know what's possible. So when things are going really well, you're all really excited and you think, wow, are we even doing this? What the hell? Whereas in a normal game, you're supposed to be thinking, yeah, that's what's supposed to happen. We've practiced. We're supposed to be doing the right things. So I think there's a short-term advantage to this sort of success from the expectations that wouldn't carry over if you just played more tournaments and he was a real player in your team. I also think you get a tactical edge because, as I mentioned before, you can scout opponents. You can get a real lineup of the opposing team and study what they do in the game while they can't scout you. That's also a short-term advantage because that wears off as soon as you become a real team, as SK and Bolts are going to find out either now or even more so in the future. In fact, obviously, they found out in the semi-finals of Oakland against NIP. It also changes your map pool a little bit, especially if you do two role swaps like they did here, not just one player. So as a result, suddenly they were really good on Overpass and Inferno. Before that, Inferno was really dodgy for Astralis, actually. So teams couldn't know that they'd be so strong on it, contrasted with the old lineup. Finally, you might play a similar style before, But you might not also. Teams don't know stylistically what you're going to swap up. Like, it looked like they played a lot more loose in Astralis now, and teams weren't necessarily prepared for that. And obviously with a stand-in, you will often go with a free-form style. Therefore, it will actually live and die by how individual players do. And that's a lot harder to counter anyway, as everyone's found trying to play against these phase CT sides. Finally, you've got the whole gambler's fallacy, which is, if it had failed, you would have just said in your mind, oh, we've just got a stand-in, like, it's not our fault, so it wouldn't have mattered. But when it succeeds, like this, that doesn't somehow mean that it's a formula you can replicate and it would work in future tournaments. In fact, most of the reasons I've given and principles as to why you succeeded, like I've outlined here, actually wouldn't work in future tournaments. More of the negatives would stack up and become more enhanced and more emphasized, while all the positives would actually start to degrade, if not disappear outright. So that doesn't mean you can repeat doing this again and again. And in fact, take away the aspect of a stand-in. This is also why a lot of teams can have an amazing performance in their first tournament with a new player who's actually going to be a new full-time player for similar circumstances. Hence, SK with Bolts looking so amazing, and then suddenly not as good at IEM Oakland at all. And you have a number of teams that come in with the first player, have this amazing result. We had Makaleli go and stand in for NIP. It happens many, many times, and then we see the drop-off in the future tournaments as all their advantages disappear and all the negatives start to stack up and all the other teams get to do what they do against every other top team and scout them and prepare for them and play against their strengths. So the implications, quite frankly, really just boil down to, you don't really want to have to take a stand-in, but if you do, sometimes it's going to work out, and at that one tournament, you'll have a little bit of a boost, but probably won't carry over. And for Astralis, maybe they should mix in more freeform play on the CT side of a map like Inferno, or when they're playing on the T side of Mirage. But beyond that, perhaps working Dupree a little bit more with the second AWP, but probably they want Device back, they want him back in his roles, they want him back as the primary AWP. They probably don't want to recruit Dennis or anyone who's not Swedish. And really, it's probably not as crazy as people think, while their performance was amazing, and if they'd have won that round, quite frankly, I think would have been the best performance with a stand-in in the history of CSGO.